Hollywood Worldviews, Watching Films with Wisdom and Discernment. How did this book come about, Brian?
Well, basically, being in the church for many years, I'd always had an interest in movies. I tended to see two extremes in the church that responded to movies. One was those who saw what was bad in movies, and they tended to reject it altogether. And those I call the cultural anorexics. They stay away from culture altogether because of what's bad in it. The other side was what I call the cultural glutton. And those are the people who tend to immerse themselves in culture, like the movies, without really discerning the good and bad, so they take in the bad with the good. And I sort of wanted to drive a pathway between those two extremes, so to help both sides to be more balanced in their approach, so that when they watch movies, they'll be discerning rather than reacting. Over 10 years of my own personal pursuit of movies and screenwriting, I studied screenwriting on the side, have been writing, trying to get into movies, and in my own personal application of my Christian philosophy to my art, which was influenced heavily by Francis Schaeffer, I basically studied how to apply my Christian worldview to the art that I was engaged in. And I felt like I really wanted to sort of give that back, basically give that back to the church and help other Christians to sort of come the pathway that I've come.
Can you talk a little bit about Francis Schaeffer and what is it about Francis that influenced you?
Yeah, Francis Schaeffer was a famous Christian philosopher back in the 60s and 70s, and he had a great influence on the Christian world in that he brought a revelation to Christians of how to understand culture through the lens of worldview. Worldview being the grid through which we interpret our experience, or the grid through which we interpret our life. And he brought that application on a very popular cultural level that helped Christians to stop reacting and cutting themselves off from culture, but learn how to start to, as I call it, interact redemptively with the culture. And by understanding the nature of worldview, that helps us to interpret what's good and what's bad in any cultural element, whether it's music, visual arts, or movies.
Round the world, straight to your homes. Here we are on Top 3 with your hosts, Rich Wilkerson Jr., Marissa Land, Chad Hardcastle, Reba Tony, we're the 90 Twins, and this is Top 3.
Now, Brian,
that's why they call it the Magic Kingdom.
Do you have a similar story? And what's your view on Superman?
Unfortunately, I don't have a great story like that. I've always loved movies. Yeah. That's pretty much it. Actually, for me personally, I had been writing for many, many years before anything ever really happened. And ironically, I was down in Orange County and writing movies, and I met a guy at my church, of all places, you know. And he was interested in movies too, and he happened to have the rights to this book that ended up being To End All Wars. Mm-hmm. Wow. And when he gave me the rights and he said, would you be interested in doing this? I said, yeah, here, let me pray for a second. Yeah, got it. Because it was definitely the kind of book that makes you cry when you read it and just moves you to tears. It's all about Allied prisoners of war during World War II and what they suffered, to find redemption. And so the story moved me so deeply that I had to write it. And I did, and ended up making that movie in like 2001 or so. So
it's incredible, man. Love it.
Now, do you purposely put messages of redemptive value into your projects, whether it be a film or a comic book?
I don't know if I would say purposely put messages. It would be more that the nature of storytelling itself is redemptive. I mean, if you read ancient Mesopotamian myths, they're redemptive. If you read modern secular horror stories, they're redemptive. It's more a question of what kind of redemption are you really providing in the story. So really all storytelling is redemptive in one manner. It's just a matter of what kind of redemption.
How would you say your faith has played into your guys' writing, even to your work?
Every writer's faith, philosophy, belief system enters into what you write. Why? Mm-hmm. Because it guides the way you think, it guides the things you're interested in. Whether you're deliberately doing it or not, your worldview is going to come through the kind of stories you tell. And I just think if you look through history, I think the better artists are, the more they're at least consciously aware of what they believe, but the better they are, they're more able to incarnate or incorporate their beliefs in the story rather than having it on the surface where it's preachy. And I think that's, unfortunately, where people of faith and religious people often fail is we tend to be preachy because we're trying to slap a message rather than letting the story incarnate the belief system.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Next, horror uncovers man's spiritual pride. Horror uncovers man's spiritual pride. What do I mean by that? Well, when man rejects God, he worships something in his place, right? For example, this is a very common one. Modern enlightened man, the modernist man, right? Like the Enlightenment when science became God. And they realized, the dark ages of religion was man's ignorance, but science will save us, right? That was the whole Enlightenment era in the 1700s and even into the present, right? Where scientists tend to think that, religion is ignorant, right? Well, a lot of horror movies play on this very theme to show modern scientific man who rejects the supernatural, who thinks that he is God, or science is God, right? That's the man who is deceived. And how does it do that? Well, first of all, let me give you a biblical example of this. On the left, you see images from the book of Daniel, and on the right, you see image from the harlot on the red beast from Revelation. In both of these books, Daniel and Revelation, fictional images are used as consequences of that very idol worship. And in particular, I think that the idol worship, all these represent kingdoms, right? So these are powers governing kingdoms and such. But think about it, those are monsters that you see in, like Godzilla and stuff, right? Those are the kind of monsters you see in monster movies, right? And the point here is that in Book of Revelation, you see genetic mutated monsters running around chasing, screaming people and eating them, right? Same thing in Daniel, beasts coming up out of the sea and destroying people and drinking blood and all this kind of stuff. Point is that I would say that Revelation is one of my favorite books, is literally a horror fantasy epic. And actually Daniel would be as well. It's got less of it, because it also includes history, but Daniel has the visions and such. But my point is that the notion of bestiality is used by God often as the metaphor for humanity without a soul, without a conscience, right? You're just an animal. That's what I think the beast helps us to see, that beasts are images that show creatureliness divorced from the moral side. What are some examples of this? Frankenstein is the classic one, right? The whole idea of Frankenstein was that Dr. Frankenstein thought he could be like God. And it literally says that in the book and in the original movie. He was trying to be like God because he thought he could create man, right? And he was creating man in his own image. But then that monster came back after him, didn't it? And it came back in revenge because man's hubris, thinking science is God, it will come back and bite you. One of my favorite examples of that is Jurassic Park. Quite literally, what is the message of Jurassic Park is, and there was a moment when they're sitting around the table and Jeff Goldblum, the scientist guy, says, well, they were so busy thinking about what could be done with science that they didn't bother to think whether it should be done. So the point of a lot of these sci-fi movies, like Jurassic Park, very, very common theme, is science without morality will come back and bite you. Literally, right? I mean, with Jurassic Park, they literally, the dinosaurs come back and bite them, right? But my point is that that's a very powerful moral, all of Michael Crichton's books and novels and movies, the Michael Crichton stuff, Jurassic Park, as well as what are some of his other ones, Timeline or whatever. They're all that same, and he deliberately was making that point, was that when we pursue man's pride and hubris of science and knowledge without moral restraint, in other words, we're not accountable. What does that sound like? Maybe cloning, maybe biogenetics, right? When people say, your moral, your religious concerns are just antiquated, right? We want to advance and progress. Well, that's going to turn around and bite you in the back in the end.